The first plate in the record shows a front-page photographed against black cloth, dated April 5th, 1909. The paper is the Arizona Gazette of Phoenix. The headline reads, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." And what the article beneath that headline claims is this. An explorer named G.E. Kincaid had found a man-made cavern high in the canyon wall, its entrance nearly 1,500 feet down a sheer cliff. Inside, passages radiating like the spokes of a wheel, several hundred rooms, copper weapons hardened by a process modern science could not explain, an idol seated like Buddha, and a crypt holding row after row of mummies. The paper quoted a Smithsonian professor and promised its readers that Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado would soon be linked. That is what the record shows on plate 1. Here is what it shows on every plate after. There is no record this expedition ever existed. No Kincaid in any archive, no professor, no cave. What follows is the file of something that never happened, and why, 117 years later, it still refuses to close. To understand why this story will not die, start with what was actually printed. The Gazette gave it the front page, under a second line that promised mysteries of an immense rich cavern being brought to light. There was no byline, there were no photographs, even though the story claimed Kincaid carried a fine camera and never travelled without it. There was exactly one source, a man nobody in Phoenix seems to have ever met. The geography was strangely precise, which is a habit of stories that want to be believed. The cavern was said to sit 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, its entrance carved into a sheer wall nearly 1,500 feet above the water, on ground almost impossible to reach. Government land, the paper added. Trespassers would face prosecution. The story built its own locked door into the second paragraph. Then it took the reader inside, a main passage running deep into the rock. Side chambers cut at right angles, hundreds of them, some large enough to hold thousands of people. A great hall with an idol seated cross-legged, which the paper compared to Buddha. Copper implements sharpened by some lost art. Granaries filled with seeds. Urns and vessels of copper and gold. A crypt where mummies lay stacked in tiers, every one of them, the article noted, male. Hieroglyphics no one could read, waiting patiently for scholars who were said to be on their way. And through all of it ran the one assumption the article never questioned. The builders, it insisted, had come from the Orient, perhaps from Egypt itself. It did not spend a single sentence considering that the ancestors of the people already living around the canyon could have built anything at all. That was 1909 talking. An invented Egyptian colony was easier to print than an acknowledged native one. Holding the whole structure upright was a single borrowed name. Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution, said to be directing the excavation underground with a crew of scientists. The institution's name did the work a photograph should have done, and there is one detail the retellings usually miss. This was not Kincaid's first appearance in the Gazette. 3 weeks earlier, on March 12th, the paper had run a small item about a lone boatman arriving in Yuma. He had rowed all the way from Green River, Wyoming, the item said, carrying a camera with which he had taken 700 views of the river. He lost an oar shooting the sluiceway at the Laguna Dam. A modest, ordinary, believable little story. Then in April, the same man returned to the page transformed, now the discoverer of the greatest archaeological find in the history of the continent. Someone at that newspaper was building a character in installments, and after April 5th, the Gazette never mentioned him again. There was no follow-up, no second expedition, no arriving scholars. The paper simply walked away from the biggest story it had ever printed, and the record goes quiet, plate by plate, as if it knew there was nothing to come back to. So who was G.E. Kincaid? The article is generous with him. It calls him an explorer of 30 years standing, all of them spent working for the Smithsonian. It even claims he was the first white child born in Idaho, the kind of frontier flourish that reads like a dime novel because it was probably written by someone who wrote like one. It has him traveling the Colorado alone, hunting for mineral deposits, spotting stains on the canyon wall high above the river, and mooring his boat to climb up and investigate. It gives him a rifle, a camera, and the calm of a man who had already seen everything. The archives are less generous. They give him nothing at all. There is no G.E. Kincaid in the Smithsonian's employment records, not in 1909 and not in the 30 years before it. And people have gone looking for over a century now. Park historians, librarians, journalists, and more than a few hopeful believers have combed census rolls, payroll ledgers, city directories, river records, and obituaries. There were Kincaids in America. None of them matched the man in the article. No birth record that fits, no death record, no grave, no letters, no descendants who ever came forward. And not one of his 700 photographs has ever surfaced, of the cavern, of the river, of anything. Then there is the silence, which is the loudest evidence in the file. By 1909, America ran on wire services. A story could cross the continent in a day, and stories far smaller than this one did so constantly. A Smithsonian expedition uncovering an Egyptian city inside the Grand Canyon would have been the story of the decade, splashed across every front page from San Francisco to New York, chased by every reporter with a train ticket. It appeared in one newspaper in Phoenix once. No rival paper sent anyone. No scientist asked to examine the copper blades. No tourist at El Tovar wrote home about the excavation crew supposedly working the cliffs upriver. The entire world outside that single page behaved in every recorded way as if nothing had happened, because nothing had. Read honestly, the record shows a man made entirely of newsprint. He rode out of one small item in March, walked onto a front page in April, and was never seen anywhere, by anyone again. The Smithsonian's answer has not changed in more than a century. The institution has no record of a G.E. Kincaid, no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan, no expedition to the Grand Canyon in 1909 that matches anything in the article, and no Egyptian artifacts from the canyon in any collection it holds. Its researchers have added, in response after response, that no credible evidence has ever been found of ancient Egyptian contact anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The institution has said all of this so many times to so many letter writers and callers and journalists that answering the Kincaid question has become a standing duty of its archives staff. The denial itself is now part of the documented history. It is, in fact, the only part of this story that has ever generated paperwork. So, say it plainly, the cave was a fiction. The expedition was a fiction. This was, almost beyond doubt, a hoax, printed by a small paper working in the great American tradition of inventing the news. Because that tradition was real, and in 1909 it was thriving. In 1835, the New York Sun spent a week describing bat-winged people living on the moon, attributed the discovery to a famous astronomer, and sold out every print run. Papers of that era manufactured petrified giants, sea serpents, buried cities, and lost races on slow news days. For the same reason modern platforms manufacture outrage: circulation. The Arizona Gazette was competing for readers in a two-paper town, and a quiet week in April was a problem with a well-known solution. The hoax genre even had its conventions, and the Kincaid story follows them like a manual. A location too remote for anyone to check, a single source who can never be reached, a respected institution's name borrowed without permission, and a promise that greater revelations were coming, which somehow never come. Every locked door the story would ever need was written into the story itself on day one. None of this was unusual for 1909. What is unusual is what happened afterward, which is nothing, and then everything. The Arizona Gazette is long dead. Its presses are gone, its building is gone, and nearly every other word it ever printed has been forgotten. The one story that outlived it, the one still multiplying more than a century later, is the one it made up. Why that happened is the real subject of this file. Here, the record has to slow down, because this is where the internet versions of the story go wrong, and where the truth deserves more careful handling. There is a tradition of emergence beneath the Grand Canyon. It was not invented by a newspaper in 1909. It belongs to the Hopi. It is a religion held and practiced today by living people. In Hopi tradition, this world is the fourth world. The people entered it from the world below through an opening called the Sipapuni, and the Sipapuni is not an abstraction on some map of myth. It is a real place, a dome of travertine rising beside the little Colorado River, in the gorge upstream of where that river meets the Colorado. For the Hopi it marks the point of emergence, a site of pilgrimage, bound into ceremony and into the long salt journeys their ancestors made down through the gorge. It is simply sacred ground. This record will state where it is and what it means, and it will go no further. Some things are not exhibits. The wider point matters just as much. The Grand Canyon was never empty land waiting for a lone white explorer to discover its secret. 11 tribes hold ancestral and living connections to the canyon, among them the Hopi, the Havasupai, the Hualapai, the Navajo, the Zuni, and the Paiute. The Havasupai live inside the canyon to this day. People have known this place for more than 10,000 years, and they never needed a newspaper to tell them there was meaning in its depths. Because the canyon's caves and cliffs really do hold what earlier hands left behind. Not Egyptian treasure, something older and stranger and better documented. In caves along the river, archaeologists have found small figurines of deer and bighorn sheep, each one bent from a single split willow twig, left in the dark 3,000 to 4,000 years ago by hunters whose names no one will ever know. High in the cliff faces stand stone granaries, real ones, built by ancestral Puebloan farmers to keep corn dry above the reach of floods. The 1909 article invented granaries in an imaginary cavern. The actual canyon had them all along in plain sight, built by the very people the article refused to imagine as builders. Set the two side by side, and the hoax comes into focus. It borrowed the shape of a genuine belief, a world beneath the canyon and a people who came out of it, and it dressed that shape in someone else's civilization. Because Egypt sold newspapers and Hopi religion did not. The Gazette printed a counterfeit of an idea whose original was real and sacred, and sitting roughly 40 miles upriver from the cave it invented. The file carries no plates of the Sipapuni. That is not an omission. Some places are not photographed because they are not ours to photograph, which leaves the question this whole file has been building toward. The story was debunked before most of the people now repeating it were born. Why is it still alive? Part of the answer is geography. Large stretches of the canyon genuinely are off limits. The gorge of the Little Colorado runs through tribal lands, with access restricted out of respect for sites that include the Sipapuni itself. The Park Service gates and closes caves across the canyon for reasons that are documented and entirely mundane. Fragile artifacts like those 4,000-year-old willow figurines, unstable rock, a fungal disease that has been killing North American bats by the millions. But a believer standing at a locked gate does not read the sign on it. To the conspiratorial eye, every closure is a confession, and the canyon has hundreds of them. Part of the answer is written on the map. Scattered across the canyon are buttes and towers named Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, the Tower of Ra, Cheops Pyramid. The names feel like evidence. They are not. They were handed out in the late 1800s by government surveyors, romantic men who reached for the grandest mythologies they knew and painted them across the rock. The exotic names were already on the map decades before the Gazette went to press, and the hoax may well have borrowed its Egyptian flavour from them. Today the map gets read backwards, as if the surveyors were leaving clues instead of showing off their libraries. And part of the answer is us. The article was rediscovered by fringe authors in the 1990s and reprinted in books about lost cities, from which it passed into the early internet, where the headline travelled and the debunking did not. Then came the forums, then YouTube, then short-form video. Through 2025 and into 2026, the Kincaid story has been running through social feeds in wave after wave, racking up tens of millions of views, most of them 30 seconds long. 30 seconds is enough time to read a 1909 headline out loud over slow footage of the canyon. It is not enough time to explain a century of silence. The Gazette needed a printing press and a slow news day. The modern version needs neither. The hoax now moves faster than it ever did in 1909, and the correction, as always, walks somewhere far behind it. The last plate in the file is not a cave. There has never been a plate of the cave in 117 years, because there has never been a cave. So let the record close the way it should. G.E. Kincaid almost certainly never lived. The expedition almost certainly never sailed. What existed was a newspaper that needed to sell, in a country that found a fabulous imported lie easier to print than the real history under its feet, and a canyon vast enough, dark enough, and closed enough in places to hold any story anyone cared to lower into it. The strange part is that the true underground of the Grand Canyon never needed inventing. There are real granaries in its cliffs, real offerings in its caves, resting in the dark since before Rome existed. and a real doorway between worlds beside the little Colorado, held sacred by a living people, carrying more history than the Gazette's imaginary mummies ever could. The cave was never down there. The question that remains is quieter, and it does not have a plate number. After 117 years of knowing better, why do we keep needing it to be? The file ends here. The long memory keeps others like it, records of things the world worked very hard to forget. One of them is already open on the desk.